Welcome to the Cosmic Eye Show, where we explore spiritual ideas and books that help you live a better life. Hosted by spiritual teacher and author of If You Can Worry, You Can Meditate, Jason Napolitano.
All right, hello, welcome to the Cosmic Eye Show. It is Sunday, and we are doing an episode today on the sun, so it's very appropriate. So happy Sunday to everyone. I am your host, Jason Napolitano, and I have on the line Chris Sheridan out in LA. How you doing, Chris?
Doing great on this Sunday, and yes, very appropriate to talk about the sun on this day.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you guys are all right. We just, I know you had an earthquake out there. What was that, yesterday? No, the day before yesterday.
Yeah, a couple
crazy.
of them.
All right, so as I said, we are going to be speaking about the sun, a universal deity. This is the chapter from Manly Hall's Secret Teachings of All Ages, chapter 9, Roman numeral 9. And a great chapter. It's kind of a companion chapter to the work that we did last week. If you heard the podcast last week on Isis being more of a feminine or water-based symbol. This is the fire and the sun aspect of things, of the sort of opposites there that come into harmony to create, all that we know as material existence. So this is the sun side of things, the masculine portion of it, the solar deity, and we're going to be looking at some of the different symbolism and emblems of the sun, its aspects and the redeemers of the world, and some of these different mythologies and so on. So it's going to be a fun show today. Thank you for listening. If you can, I want to first thank our listeners and supporters who are supporting us financially. If you can, we ask that you could please donate to us if you get a chance. You can do that through anchor.fm /cosmic eye, and you can click on there and you can do anywhere from 99 cents to $9.99 a month to support the show. We would greatly appreciate if you do that, because it does help us get the show out to more people and share this kind of great esoteric and spiritual information with people. So if you are getting something out of it, please help us out, and we can get it out to more people. Hopefully make the world a little better place with a little more spiritual knowledge. That is our goal. So, all right, let's jump right into this then. I'm going to start kind of from the beginning, where Manly Hall starts speaking a little bit about and kind of an overview of the sun, some of the different gods, and so on. There's a great quote that I'm going to read just to start this out. He's quoting from Albert Pike from Morals and Dogma. Albert Pike, of course, a Freemason, 33rd degree Mason, famous philosopher and Freemason, who wrote that great book, Morals and Dogma. And I'm going to go ahead and read this. So he says, to them, and he's speaking of archaic peoples, he, the sun, was the innate fire of bodies, the fire of nature, author of life, heat, and ignition. He was to them the efficient cause of all generation, for without him there was no movement, no existence, no form. He was to them immense, indivisible, imperishable, and everywhere present. It was their need of light and his creative energy that was felt by all men, and nothing was more fearful to them than his absence. His beneficent influences caused his identification with the principle of good and the Brahma of the Hindus, the Mithras of the Persians, Atum, Amun, Ptah, and Osiris of the Egyptians, and Bel, or Baal, as is also known, of the Chaldeans or the Babylonians, and the Adonai of the Phoenicians. The Adonis and Apollo of the Greeks became but personifications of the sun, the regenerating principle, image of that fecundity which perpetuates and rejuvenates the world's existence. Of course, last week we spoke about Isis, the Virgin of the world, and you wanted to talk a little bit about that, the connection to that with Isis and the birth of the sun. Why don't you share a little bit about that and kind of tie these two together real quick? This week's sun and then last week's Isis, or the kind of mother matrix of the world discussion that we had.
Well, sure. We already starting to see the connection. We're seeing some themes and some images and symbols being repeated, sometimes in a different clothing, like we talked about in the last episode, the connection between Isis, Virgin of the World, to connect it to the Virgin Mary, the mother of wisdom. And so in this image, the facing page to the beginning of this chapter, there's a beautiful Isis, beautiful Mary. There's again looking very much like the Isis, same artist, and she's holding the Christ child, illuminated Christ child, in her arms, very similar to Isis and Horus we've seen in Egyptian symbology. And in the caption below, all states that the symbol of Mary, or the Virgin Mother, relates to faith, and then the Christ child relates to wisdom. And you can see she's standing on an orb, ostensibly the earth, with a snake coiled around it. And the statement goes on to say that wisdom, that is this Christ child, born from faith, shall redeem the world, which she's standing upon. It's encircled by the serpent of evil. So that this connection between this force, this generative force of love and faith, brings forth, brings to the earth. So it kind of connects the two of them together. You have this earthy thing below, and this, heavenly, or even beyond the heavens, image above. And what is born of that is this child, this son, the S-U-N, the S-O-N, the redeemer of the world, just as it redeems the winter and the sun comes back after the solstice, and gives life to everything on this earth. So there's definitely a very strong connection, and we see this throughout, and we'll see it again, I'm sure, as we go on.
All right, thank you, Chris, for that information about Isis and Mary and some of that symbolism. Good stuff. Helps us to tie together what we're talking about today and what we talked about last week. So if you want, check out that other podcast that we did last week's on Isis, Mysteries of Isis, Isis, Virgin of the World. It's a great one. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is the kind of the early connections to religion and the sun. Manly Hall points out that the adoration of the sun was one of the earliest and most natural forms of religious expression. Complex modern theologies are merely involvements and amplifications of this simple Aboriginal belief. And then he says, the primitive mind, I'm quoting here, by the way, from Secret Teachings, the primitive mind, recognizing the beneficent power of the solar orb, adored it as the proxy of the supreme deity.
Yeah, that's very astute, because yes, there was this astronomical phenomenon, whether it's the sun or the moon or the phases or eclipse or things. And yes, they were venerated and perhaps worshipped in the symbolism, but it wasn't the celestial object itself that was being worshipped. It was the effect, the meaning that symbolized. So even just to say that, they were worshiping the sun, even if they were, or they had veneration for the solar orb, it was really made meaningful by what the symbol connected to in their lives. If the winter solstice, then the sun is coming back, so things will be warmer and things will get green again. It had such significance, more than just an observation. It was very ingrained in their experience.
Good point. And one of the other things actually they brought up in that video is, for example, with that winter solstice, is he also talked about how the ancient Egyptians saw that time of the winter solstice and winter as being the most spiritual time of the year. It was the time when one was able to go within, in the same way that a seed lay dormant in the earth, and then it sprouts in the spring, and you see it coming forth in the phases of the sun and so on. But this particular time in the winter for human beings, and the quality actually of the sun itself, its rays, sent out more sort of introspective sort of an energy, which I found very interesting. And I think you can make that argument if you look at your own life. I find in my own life, certainly in winter, I'm much more introspective. First of all, I'm a Capricorn, so, it's going to hit me. But I'm more introspective in general. But I have noticed in winter, I do tend to go within myself, and I'm a little less extroverted. I'm a little more introverted. I'm a little more introspective at that time of the year. And I think even with when we think about like the New Year's resolutions and so on, I think we tend to be more introspective, and we try to rectify some of the mistakes, or kind of reconnect with our goals and so on at that particular time of the year, because I think you could make a good argument that we are a bit more introspective during winter. It's darker, the days are shorter. It certainly has that quality. It's colder if you're not in, well, it's colder everywhere, but I mean, it's not, obviously we don't have winter here in Southern California and in Nevada where I'm at, to the degree that you do on the East Coast and so forth, but it's colder. And, I think that does lend itself to a sort of a more introspective kind of a thing. And you could think where, with the ancient peoples, probably at this time, you're eating stored foods, you're huddled around fires, you're trying to keep warm. This is a time of storytelling and sharing and games and mythology. There's much less outer activity and so forth. Do you know what I mean? And so I think it's apt.
Yeah, that's
that.
Well, it is, just like we're saying that these are more connected in a very real way with their lives. It's not the equinox. Did they really care? The equinox. I mean, it's spring. It's it's so significant beyond just a celestial coordinate or something that we might look at it scientifically.
Exactly, and that's why I wanted to kind of make that point that Manly Hall went on. Later on, he wrote this book early on when he was a young man, Secret Teachings, and so I think this kind of he does kind of oversimplify that to a degree, not to be critical, but I think like I said in that astrotheology lecture, he kind of opens it up more and says, yes, that is true. This is one of the meanings, but you can't necessarily just reduce down, all religions are just misguided sort of solar or astronomical phenomenon. And that's what we're basing them on. And I think there's good evidence in terms of the mythology, in terms of the philosophy of the Greeks and even earlier cultures, that they know that at least the sophisticated members of society did know that. And I mean, like in the Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, as within, so without, you see that they're touching on that idea. They see that the universe and the cosmological happenings and the astronomical phenomenon, so forth, are analogous to what is happening within the human on a microcosmic level, the macrocosm and the microcosm. And so, that's something to remember. I think we sometimes oversimplify the ancient mind and think, these mythologies are just simple-minded tellings of scientific phenomenon that they didn't understand. And it's a little demeaning to the ancient mind, which brought us to the place that we are today. Through their wisdom. Do you know what I mean? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, well, it's our hubris, and we think, we're so advanced because we have, cars and planes and cell phones and things like that. But I would go even further and say that the ancients had a much better understanding of the inner life. Perhaps they didn't quite understand the natural world in the scientific lens through which we view it now. They might not have had that terminology or the instrumentation, but they certainly saw what was going on. They could predict eclipses and did a lot of sciencey things
without computers,
but the
mind
emphasis,
you, without the modern conveniences that we have to do that, and they were incredibly accurate.
Well, their main instrument of perception, their own consciousness, was much more fine-tuned because, yes, we can peer deeper with microscopes and telescopes, but it's also, there's sort of like an atrophy of perception. I don't know if that's a term or should be one.
Yeah.
But as we rely on these things, then we trust them beyond trusting ourselves. And so our intuitive and some of these more mysterious parts of our consciousness, the really creative and insightful parts of our inner wisdom just get turned over and deferred to some readout on a machine, and then that gets trusted. They've really developed the sense of that, and again, to reiterate, these objects and these phenomena that were happening in the outer world with the sun going through its cycle of the year and the equinoxes was so important because of that connection that you're talking about, that as above, so below, as out there, so in here. That's also where their focus was. It wasn't just worshiping out there. It was, okay, this is important because it's in here and we have to pay attention. And this outer world is showing us something that is connected, and we can see out there maybe what we can't see in here as much. So it's always the pathway was inward. You know, that what we see out here is really a mirror reflection of what's happening in here. And we've lost that in the centuries and millennia that have passed. We moved from superstition through religious dogma, and now it's scientificism, or whatever it's called, where we rely on scientists who are actually human and just as fallible as anybody else. But the real loss is that we have lost touch with our own inner wisdom that we all have to some degree. And the more that we can get in tune with that and unfold that and rely on it, doesn't mean we're going to do away with science and things like that. But we're just have been so out of touch for so long. And I think that's why there's maybe a yearning for deeper symbolism and metaphysical and esoteric teachers and information right now. That's why Manly Hall is so popular years after his death on YouTube, of all places. That didn't exist during his lifetime. It's because I think innately we know we're missing something. We're missing a part of ourselves that was so important to ancient, so-called primitive Aboriginal cultures, that in that sense, they were much more sophisticated than we are today.
That's a great point. I think, it's a different tool or a different sort of type of consciousness that they use that we have, as you say, kind of gotten away from. And, the scientific viewpoint and the kind of rational viewpoint that we prize so highly today is a fantastic thing. It's gotten us a lot of great forward movement in technology, and obviously this these podcasts and videos and all this great stuff that we're able to get these days is a result of that. But then in turn, in some ways, we've lost a certain type of more intuitive and heart-oriented sort of way of looking at things. And I think that the earlier cultures were much more in tune with that sort of way of being. And actually, even there are cultures today that still are more in tune with that. Some of the indigenous peoples and so on are still practicing religious beliefs that are closer to probably what most of early men and women sort of practiced. And so, they haven't necessarily lost a mythological viewpoint, or they're more immersed in a mythological viewpoint. And thus they're more intuitive and a little bit more heart-centered and a little bit more connected to the earth than I think we are in our intellectual, scientific ivory towers. And that's disappointing because, Europe had its own indigenous traditions. The Middle East had its own indigenous traditions. The ancient Near East obviously had various religious movements and so on that were more connected to the earth, connected to the stars, the movements of the planets and so on. And so as time went on, I think we began to look at these phenomenon as scientific events instead of something connected to our lives. In the same way that we kind of look and think about food these days. I mean, you go to a grocery store, oftentimes they'll do these things. I watch a lot of these slow food videos and organic gardening videos and things like that. And they'll go into cities and ask kids where things come from, and they'll say the grocery store. I mean, they'll literally ask, like, where does an egg come from? I don't know, the grocery store. It comes out of a box. And so there's there's a disconnection. I mean, and how often do we go to the grocery store and really think about where the foods come from out of the earth, and where do they, you know what I mean? And so that disconnection in this technological world is a challenge. So I think that's why it's important to study this material. It's going to get a connection back to, the sort of ancient way of looking at things, and it encourages us to be more connected to our environment, the cycles of life, the seasons, the earth itself. And, as advanced as we get, we're never going to outgrow the cycles of the earth. I mean, we can kind of bend them, and we can sort of pretend like we're above and beyond them. But eventually, I mean, as we're seeing through climate change and so on, and through the decimation of a lot of the natural world and, biodiversity and so on, we do so at our own peril. Whether or not you agree with the idea of global warming, we can all agree that there's less less of the natural world, and certainly less species. This can't be argued. So, I think that, kind of getting in touch with these ancient ways is a way that we can get in touch with the natural world again. All right, so getting back to some of the symbolism, let's talk about the Solar Trinity. I think this is a neat section. I like this one. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and kind of get into the origin of the Trinity? That's down. That's a little bit down in the second paragraph of that first portion of it, about the movement of the sun and so on. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, sure. Of course, the Trinity of Christianity is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, or Holy Spirit. In the Hindu tradition, it's Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, the creator, sustainer, and destroyer. And to find a parallel between those two is, kind of hard. Yeah, there's three of them, but do they really relate to each other? I'm not really sure. But if we look at them through this solar imagery, this symbol of the sun, and again, not the fiery ball of light, although that's a huge part of it. And just to add on what you were saying about being out of touch with nature, I think there's probably nowhere in nature something more relevant to people's lives, even today, than the sun. It's still nighttime. It's still hot. It's still cold in the winter. So whether we realize it or not, we are connected to the sun, if nothing more than it determines what kind of a jacket we put on when we go outside. But this solar trinity actually relates to the Oedipus riddle of the Sphinx. And that is the sun being, one in the morning, one throughout the day, and another one in the evening. So the morning sun relates to the Father, because this is the beginning of the day, the generative, this is producing this light. And then the sun, what is given birth, is the day where we can toil and work and do our things. And then at night, it becomes the Holy Spirit. So it's setting and it's going away in the sense, but that's the time for maybe the invisible sun to become more known, just like you're talking about during the winter, to be more introspective, so that Holy Spirit that kind of runs through everything is more active than in the evening. So that's within a day, you have this solar trinity between the morning, the noon, and the evening sun as it rises and lights up the world and then sets into the night.
All right, great. Thank you for sharing that. That's a good way to put it. It's interesting because, again, they took something from the observable world and then they connected it to these symbolic representations of the different mythologies and the different gods. And as we said before, it's not just that they were trying to explain phenomenon that they didn't understand. It's that I do believe they understood these phenomenon, but also they were trying to connect them to human life and connect them to different phases in our life, like I said, and so forth. And so that gets us into our next portion of it is, the movement of the apparent movement of the sun, not the movement of the sun, but the apparent movement of the sun through the different the precession of the equinoxes, and that's under this section of Christianity and the sun in the Secret Teachings. So I'm going to read this because Manly Hall really puts it nicely and succinctly, and he talks about these four phases. So he says, and I quote, "The philosophers of Greece and Egypt divided the life of the sun during the year into four parts. Therefore, they symbolized the solar man by four different figures. When he was born in the winter solstice, the sun god was symbolized as a dependent infant who, in some mysterious manner, had managed to escape the powers of darkness seeking to destroy him while he was still in the cradle of winter. The sun, being weak at this season of the year, had no golden rays or locks of hair, but the survival of the light through the darkness of winter was symbolized by one tiny hair which alone adorned the head of the celestial child. As the birth of the sun took place in Capricorn, it was often being represented being suckled by a goat. So that's the first phase of it. That's the winter solstice. Second phase is the vernal equinox. He says, at the vernal equinox, the sun had grown to be a beautiful youth. His golden hair hung in ringlets on his shoulders, and his light, as Schiller said, extended to all parts of infinity. At the summer solstice, this is part 3 of the movement. The summer solstice, the sun became a strong man, heavily bearded, who in the prime of maturity symbolized the fact that nature at this period of the year is strongest and most fecund. At the autumnal equinox, the fourth portion, the sun was pictured as an aged man, shuffling along with bended back and whitened locks into the oblivion of winter darkness. Thus, 12 months were assigned to the sun as the length of its life. During this period, it circled the 12 signs of the zodiac in a magnificent triumphal march. Now, this is it's interesting symbolism. A lot of the time, too, you get, if you're a fan of these ancient alien shows, you get a lot of this symbolism in their explanations for things, because they find symbols that correspond to these celestial happenings, and then they tend to take an approach whereby it's the sort of the opposite approach of the religious idea, where we would determine down to one point, just say all religion is an explanation, is explanations of celestial movements, or or is sun worship in a different form. The sort of ancient aliens version of that is all religion is misunderstood, information, celestial and astronomical and astrological, and explained as as gods or myths, or as these different figures or movements that they saw. Or they would say basically it's the gods are ancient aliens, misunderstood. So both of those points of view are kind of similar in the sense that they're trying to resolve down this symbolic understanding of the macrocosm and the microcosm into usually macrocosmic or microcosmic interpretations of a very determined single point. And that the thing we've got to remember, we talked a little bit about this last week, is that symbolism is deep and it's rich and it carries multiple meanings always, because if it can be resolved down to one thing, it would be a sign and not a symbol. And everything in this book that we talk about in Manly Hall's work in general, but particularly in the Secret Teachings, is explanations of symbols. So you cannot just make these simple one-to-one relationships. That would be a sign, like a stop sign or a plus sign. It means to add in mathematics. That's a sign, not a symbol. A symbol, on the other hand, is suggestive of certain things, but it's not limited to those things. So that's something to remember. Did you have anything to add about that sort of procession of the equinoxes and that sort of movement through those 4 phases?
Well, I like the 4 phases, and they relate to the 4 seasons, but seasons in our life. We have a May-December relationship, somebody younger, somebody older. It still plays in some of the terms and phrases that we use, but I think already now we've talked about 3 major solar movements, or apparent movements, like you clarified. One's the solar day. You have this trinity during the day. Then there's the solar year, where the sun moves around the zodiac, or appears to, from our point of view. And then the larger one, the much larger one, is the sun traversing through the equinoxes, which is 26 to 28,000 years in its cycle. And that was very important. You can easily see how a day and night, or where the sun is during the day, or sunset. Oh, the sun's going down. Will it come up again? Yes, Helios pulls the sun back up again with his chariot of 4 horses the next morning. Or the solar year, because the seasons and everything, in a northern latitude is very significant for your life. You know, the four seasons, planting, everything, even how animals migrate and hibernate, but why this larger one? That it was so important that even the ancients, who didn't have the instrumentation that we know of, seemed to understand this much larger cycle, and not only understood it and recognized it, identified it, made it part of this, this worship, so to speak, or part of the mythology and religious relation that they have with the sun. So that's something maybe that goes even beyond this chapter and maybe further discussion. But I just find it that interesting that it was so important, so significant, that all these aspects of the sun, astronomical, visible and otherwise, were so important, and mostly important how it relates to, because we have our solar plexus. We have, it's even called that in our body, and that's right in the middle. The yellow chakra, if you will, is in this solar region, kind of in the middle. So it's even part of our bodies, if you will, as it is part of our worldly life.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that the ancient peoples who came up with those psycho-spiritual centers in the body and with the chakras were definitely connected to these symbolic ideas and this mythology, as well as the knowledge that they had about the universe and the different aspects of cosmology as they understood it. All right, so getting into some more symbolism. This section is called the Three Suns. I found this one really interesting. I'm going to lay out a little bit of what Manly Hall had to say, and then I'll let you kind of carry it forward, because I greatly appreciate your insight into these. The solar orb, like the nature of man, was divided by the ancient sages into three separate bodies. According to the mystics, there are three suns in each solar system, analogous to the three centers of life in each individual constitution. These are called three lights: the spiritual sun, the intellectual or solar sun, and that's soul spelled S-O-U-L, solar. That's a cool use of that word. I like that. And the material sun, now symbolized in Freemasonry by three candles. That's those three aspects. The spiritual sun manifests the power of God the Father. The solar sun radiates the life of God the Son. And the material sun is the vehicle of manifestation for God the Holy Spirit. So man's nature then was divided by the mystics into three distinct parts: spirit, soul, and body. Spirit, soul, and body. So let's talk a little bit about that. We did speak a bit about that before, but this is also, I think this is connected to those three stages also. The three parts of the day that we were talking about that you highlighted, but in kind of a different way. So can you talk a little bit about the spirit, the soul, and the body?
Yes, it's as it's not only a time thing, but now we have the three different aspects of existence, which so many traditions, body, soul, and spirit, mind, body, and soul, that we have for us, and we know we have this, triune or trinity of our own personal existence, and again, it brings the sun into the body, or the sun as this thing out there is something that we have in here, or what it does out there, or how it operates, or what it means out there has an operation, has a meaning, has a significance in our life. And there are different types of light. I think that's what some of this is getting at, that having not only these three centers of activity or aspects of the body, we also have the brain, the heart, and then our reproductive generative system. That these are the main centers of what motivates us and how we can move through the world, and having that connect to the sun is in some way illuminating what's important, because there were some other I guess the Rosicrucians, also thought of, the three suns or looked at them like that, but made a very important distinction between two types, I guess, of light. One is attributed to Lucifer, the light bearer, bearing the light, and the other one associated with the Christ energy. And that if you just have the one light, if you just have an intellectual understanding or here's an atom smasher, okay, that can be very dangerous if you don't have the ethics and the moral responsibility and the wisdom, tempered in this wisdom of this Christ energy, that sun, that light, is the protector, the redeemer, the resolver. That if you just have that one light, and that's maybe where this negative connotation with Lucifer, because if you just look at the word, bearing the light, well, what's wrong with that? Bring on the light. We want enlightenment. It sounds kind of good if you look at the etymological thing, but how it's used, at least in this Rosicrucian concept, is that just having a basic knowledge of something without the wisdom to use it properly, ethically, is tantamount to evil. Because, it might be hit and miss. You might do some good things, might do some bad things, but it's dangerous if you don't know what it is. It's you don't let a 6-year-old behind the wheel of a car. I mean, they, might do pretty well for a while, but it's probably not going to end well. So that distinction, and also again, that two types of a light. So just opening up, the mind to something, is good, but it can be dangerous if it's not used properly. And I think that's some of the danger I see in what's popular to go off on a tangent, but these eye-opening or mind-expanding drugs or DMT or ayahuasca experiences that, again, it's this external thing. Fine if you're using it in ceremony, you know what it's about, and you're mentally and spiritually trained to understand and integrate this experience, or just to even have this experience. But without that training, then you're just blindly opening up something, and it could, produce a whole host of errors that would, certainly follow. Whereas if you have an understanding and put it in the context and know what it can do and what it can't do, you're in a much better place where maybe you don't need as much of the ayahuasca to kind of artificially open up something that you're not already prepared for. And I think a lot of these meditative and spiritual disciplines.
That's a great point. And I think sometimes people forget that, along with that visionary experience, they do need the training and the experience of someone who understands what those symbols mean and can help them work through what they're seeing and sort of process it and then apply it to their lives. It's not just, I think that's one of the problems with the drug experimentation of the 60s with the hippies and so forth is, there were genuine seekers of wisdom who genuinely, followed that path of exploration in a constructive way. And then there were people who, blew out their minds on too much LSD because, they wanted to break on through to the other side. And, they were kind of caught up in the sort of popular mythology of the day, and they weren't prepared for it. The body, the mind were not prepared for those spiritual experiences. And it literally, devastated those people's lives. And it happens even today. I mean, you get a lot of people just pushing themselves to extremes. They end up in mental institutions with psychedelics and so on because they're not using them properly. And that's one of the dangers. And you see a lot of the, the popularity of psychedelics, DMT, ayahuasca, mushrooms, and all the various shamanistic sort of approaches to, opening up the mind to visionary experiences. Really popular on YouTube today and on podcasts and so on. And I'm not against that by any means. It's just that I think some people haven't prepared themselves for that journey, and it can be very dangerous, and you have to remember that and do those psychedelics and experiment with those things with proper guidance and direction. And and instruction from people who understand it and don't just go about, kind of willy-nilly experimenting with things that might blow your mind out, honestly. And so, that's the danger of that spiritual vision coming on too fast. And the ancients had a lot of guards against people getting those experiences. That's why I think a lot of times a lot of this spiritual wisdom was hidden in allegory and mythology and so on, because even an idea that leads you to a different understanding or truth about the universe can have the effect of sort of blowing out your moral and ethical understandings of life, or it could make you somewhat nihilistic. And so they tried to conceal a lot of these ideas behind symbolism so that they didn't shake people's sort of day-to-day faith in life, in the gods, in their fellow human being, and so on. That we need that stuff in order to function in a proper way on a daily basis. All right, so that brings us about to the end of this. I do want to share one more quote. This is a great quote from The Secret Symbols of the Rosicrucians, a Franz Hartmann book on alchemy. And this is quoted from The Secret Teachings on page 142 of the Reader's Edition. The symbol of wisdom, the center of power or heart of things. The sun is a center of energy and a storehouse of power. Each living being contains within itself a center of life which may grow to be a sun. In the heart of the regenerated, the divine power stimulated by the lighted logos grows into a sun which illuminates his mind. In a note, the same author amplifies his description by adding, the terrestrial sun is the image or a reflection of the invisible celestial sun. The former is in the realm of spirit, what the latter is in the realm of matter, but the latter receives its power from the former. So on that note, I would like to say, open up your spiritual suns inside, and let the light shine forth, right? So thank you, Chris, for all of your great insights. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're clarifying some of the stuff. I was a little bit fuzzy on some of the things I was pointing out, and you did a great job of reining that back in and using some better terminology than I think I used at times. So thank you for that.
Right.
And thanks, listeners, for joining us each week. We're here every Sunday with a new episode of Cosmic Eye. We appreciate you listening. Again, like I said, if you can support us, please do. We're at anchor.fm/Cosmic Eye. And also, please, if you'd like to learn more about meditation or more about spiritual experiences, you can check out my book, If You Can Worry, You Can Meditate, by Jason Napolitano, or Chris Sheridan's book, The Spirit in the Sky, which is a great story of his spiritual experience and some of the challenges he had adjusting to life in a wheelchair after a plane crash. A fantastic read. So thank you again for joining us. Have a great week. Goodbye, and God bless.